Paribrajakacharyasto Tarasata Shishimad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Premsiko Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Arigor Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shaimakunda Radha Kundi Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ki Jai. Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. We're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Volume 2, written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're just finishing up the chapter entitled Stay High Forever. Prabhupada was preaching to a very exclusive. He had to present Krishna consciousness in such a way that they would be attracted. So last week, we heard about 3 new devotees who were attracted to Srila Prabhupada's Krishna consciousness movement. One was Dan Clark. He was a film producer. He was married, and he saw the devotees in the park. He also saw the newspaper articles. Therefore, he went to the park to find Srila Prabhupada. The other was Bob. Bob was working in an administrative job in the U.S. government. He was also married, and he had one young son, 6 years old, whose name was Eric. And then we heard about Judy. Judy wasn't planning to meet the devotees. She had had a fight with her father, left her home, which was about an hour and a half away from the temple, and she was going to a girlfriend's house in the Lower East Side, and she just happened to go to Tompkins Square, where the devotees were singing that day on Sunday, and she heard the chanting and was very attracted. She also happened to be under the influence of LSD when she saw the devotees. So that was extremely, all of her senses were very much attracted to this nice singing and dancing. So we're going on now. After that Sunday, when Prabhupada had his kirtan, then there was a special rally because the California government had made the taking of LSD illegal. So Prabhupada sent the devotees to Tompkins Square to take part in that rally, not because they had any interest in LSD, but because there was going to be a lot of people, so why not chant Hare Krishna? And because there was no organization to this rally, it turned out the chanting of Hare Krishna became the rally. And everyone there, hundreds and hundreds of people, took part in the chanting, and the devotees were so ecstatic, they came back and reported it to Prabhupada. So now the devotees, these 3 new devotees, Bob, Dan, Judy, they're coming back to the temple to meet the devotees, finally to meet Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada had just had one initiation at that time, his first disciples. Now we're going to read on about the continuation of Prabhupada attracting all these young men and women. At the storefront, one of the devotees offered Judy some prasadam, a chapati, and then invited her up to the Swami's room. So Judy, she followed the group back to 26 2nd Avenue. She was still under the influence of a very strong intoxicant, LSD, but she was very attracted to the chanting. Upstairs, she entered the large front room, which was filled with fragrant smoke. There were tall flower vases, and sesame seeds were on the floor. She saw the Swami bow before the little picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, and then stand and leave the room, closing the door behind him. So Prabhupada also had just come back with the devotees. He had offered his obeisances in front of his altar, which was very nicely decorated by that time, and then went into his room. Judy, she was watching Srila Prabhupada as he bowed down in front of his altar. Judy decided that he must have been bowing to the floor itself, because under the influence of LSD, she came to the conclusion that she was God, and everything around her was revolving around her being God. So she thought that everything was in relationship to her, and therefore Prabhupada, bowing down, he was just bowing to the floor, which just is an extension of her energy. She didn't have a clue of the philosophy at that time. Around her, everyone was softly chanting on beads, and although she couldn't make out the words, it seemed peaceful. One of the Swami's disciples told her she could come into the back room, that's where Prabhupada was, and she followed, curious. The Swami was sitting there on his mat, looking effulgent. There were about 10 other people in the room. Prabhupada asked her if she liked the chanting in the park, and she replied, "I loved it." "Do you live near here?" he asked. Judy flashed on her idea that she was the all-pervading truth and answered in a way which she thought must have sounded very mystical. "Oh, I live very near." "Good," said Swamiji. "Then you can come for our morning kirtan in class." Here's where God gets trapped. Then she realized that she didn't live so near and that it would mean traveling an hour and a half from the Bronx to visit the Swami. But she decided that since he had asked her, she would come. Then she thought, "I'm making this up," because according to her, she was God and everything around here was just expanded from her. But Prabhupada assured her, as if knowing her thoughts, "This process is nothing you have made up. It is very old, very simple, and sublime." He leaned back. "We are eternal," he said, "and everything around us is temporary." Judy was now coming down from the LSD. By the time she left the Swami, it was late. She had wanted to stay overnight, but the boys hadn't allowed her. But she was determined to join. So now Judy was going to, because there was only a bunch of boys lying, they would sleep right on the floor of the mattress gift shop. And before this, the only other girl that we had heard about, really, who was serious, was Jan, who became Janaki. And they had their own apartment at the Bowery. So there was no question of any girls staying at the apartment at that time, which meant she'd have to go an hour and a half back to her parents' house in the Bronx by subway, and it was dark. It was already getting late. So an hour and a half she had to go back, and then she was determined that the next morning she would come back for the morning class, because it was Sunday, and Prabhupada had morning class every morning, but Monday, Wednesday, and Friday he had the evening class. Okay, so now we have Judy. She's going back to her house. Now Satsrup Maharaj again introduces Bob Corrins. For Bob, it seemed natural to follow up on what he had seen in the park. He began attending the evening classes, and he started reading the Bhagavatam at home and chanting, because Bob had a government job and he had a family. So in the evening time, he was able to leave his family and come for the classes from 7 to 9. His wife at that time had no interest, and she had the little boy to take care of as well. But Bob, he had been so attracted to the chanting at Tompkins Square that even his wife was surprised. She saw him dancing with the devotees. So he was immediately affected by this. He framed the picture from the Bhagavatam dust jacket depicting the spiritual sky and placed it on his small homemade altar. He would offer flowers before the picture and sit before it chanting Hare Krishna. So this is not accidental. Prabhupada explained several times in letters and to the devotees that his disciples were sent to him by his spiritual master to assist him. And for those of us who took birth in America at that time, we had no real interest in anything going on in America. One might have an American dream that America is very wonderful, but America is just the material world, full of suffering, birth, death, disease, and old age. And as soon as Prabhupada came to America and we met Srila Prabhupada, we just surrendered our lives to him. And Prabhupada explains that one cannot take up Krishna consciousness unless they'd had association with devotees in their previous life. So those of us who took birth in the West, who were able to so quickly give up our materialistic life and surrender to Srila Prabhupada, we understand that it was not accidental. We took our birth in different parts of the world just to assist Srila Prabhupada. This isn't making us think in an egoistic way. It's just that we were placed there by the Supreme Lord to assist Srila Prabhupada. And all of us have that same inheritance from our spiritual masters, that we're just servants of our gurus. We say every day in our Guru Puja that from birth after birth, let us serve you. You've opened up our eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. So the disciple is willing to travel with the Guru wherever his Guru sends him on the mission of Krishna consciousness. So here was Bob. The first time Bob saw Prabhupada's books in a head shop, that's where they sell all types of things for taking intoxicants, he thought the book was too advanced for him. But now after chanting Hare Krishna, listening to Prabhupada's evening classes, he had taken that jacket cover, framed it, and was now worshiping it with flowers every day in his home. This is Bob here. Yes, this Rupanuga. He's very famous amongst the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. He made so many devotees in the Buffalo Temple. We have 2 devotees here from Canada today. They're just across the border. And many devotees would go back and forth between the Buffalo Temple, which was just below the border of Canada. They'd go to Toronto, they'd go to Montreal, and it was like a hatching ground, Buffalo. So many devotees were made there, and then they go be sent to other temples. Bob was fascinated by the philosophy and the books and classes. And from the very beginning, he was amazed that Swamiji's teachings answered all his questions. He listened carefully and accepted. It seemed like once I decided that he was telling the truth, I just accepted everything that he said. Not that part of it was the truth and the rest of it I would have to think about. So this is the special mercy of the Supreme Lord. Here was a middle-class person with a family, holding a job, obviously well-established, well-educated. He was working on his master's degree. He was trying to get a nicer apartment for his family in New York City. And here he comes across the devotees, and all of his spiritual questions were answered by hearing from Srila Prabhupada, and he accepted it. So this is not something that just happens automatically. This is lifetime after lifetime of cultivation of Krishna consciousness. As Sri Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, that for the fallen yogi, whatever advancement he's made in this lifetime, he takes his birth either in a wealthy family or an aristocratic family or a family of transcendentalists. And from that point, he can pick up his Krishna consciousness by associating with the devotees and then make further advancement. So whatever point we're at in our Krishna consciousness, in this lifetime we should strive to make more advancement. Even if we don't perfect the process in this lifetime, but Prabhupada says we should try to perfect it. Why make our guru come back to help us again? Still, in our next lifetime, we're able to pick up whatever percentage we've completed, we go on from there. October 19th. Now this is Dan. It was Monday evening after the Sunday kirtan in the park, and Dan arrived at the storefront for kirtan. The kirtan was in full swing, and when he entered, the first thing he noticed was some people playing on the innards of an upright piano leaning against the wall near the door. Because a lot of these people would just come for the kirtan. They were musicians, and they had all kinds of musical instruments. So the piano, an upright piano, has all of the chords against the wall, and they were strumming on those chords. A boy handed him some wooden sticks. So the devotees, they would have all these different types of instruments, little finger cymbals. They didn't have real kartals yet, except Prabhupada had. And wooden sticks, anything to get the visitors involved in the kirtan more. And he sat down and joined in the kirtan. Then came the Swami's lecture, which Dan thought was long and serious, about how sexual desire causes bondage and suffering. And he wasn't expecting that. The temple was crowded and stuffy, and Dan was shocked by the lecture, but he stayed on because he knew there would be another kirtan. He felt uneasy that the Swami's followers were all celibate, but because he liked the kirtans, he resolved to keep coming. Dan was married, and his wife had no interest in the Krishna consciousness. She didn't come along with him. Neither did Bob's wife come along with him. But they were attracted to the kirtan. Bob was attracted to the philosophy. And though Dan found the lecture to be too serious, too much stressing on celibacy, because he was attracted to the kirtan, he sat and he listened. And we know what happens when you listen. When the transcendental sound vibration goes into the ears, it goes into the heart as well. So he was getting transformed. The Swami wasn't quite what Dan had expected. He had imagined something of a light-hearted Zen Roshi, laughing and joking with sparkling eyes and words filled with paradoxes. So for those of you who don't know what Zen is one school of Buddhism. And it's impersonal. They have no concept of God as a person. And some of their paradoxes are, what is the sound of a person clapping with just one hand? Or they'll say, if a tree in a forest falls down and no one has seen the tree, did the tree actually fall down? These are all paradoxes that one should meditate on in Zen Buddhism. And Zen Buddhism at that time had become quite popular amongst the hippies, or the people taking these psychedelic drugs, because they could meditate on the nothingness and the absolute, the absurdity of life. And then the intoxication would give them some purpose in their life. But he found that, and the Zen Aroshi is like a priest, one who teaches, so. But he found the Swami just the opposite, very straightforward and even cutting in his speech, and his mouth turned down at the corners, making him look mournful. Dan happily took to the kirtans, thinking they would aid his impersonal meditation, but the lectures kept stressing that God was a person. Dan resisted. He mentally debated with Prabhupada. He was partial to Dr. Radhakrishnan's interpretation of the Gita, and yet the Swami often launched ruthless attacks against such impersonal ideas. So at that time, because Prabhupada had not yet printed his Bhagavad Gita, he would sometimes read from his commentaries, but he was using the Dr. Radhakrishna's translation because the translations were correct according to the Sanskrit. So Prabhupada would read those translations and then speak according to the Vaishnava philosophy. But he rejected the commentaries of Dr. Radhakrishna, who, for example, would say it is not unto Krishna that we should surrender, but to the unborn within Krishna. So this impersonalist philosophy was what Prabhupada was defeating, and many of the young men and women had been studying Bhagavad Gita according to the impersonal philosophy. No one had yet introduced God or Krishna as a person. Gradually, Dan saw his impersonal barrier crumble, and he came to admit that on every count, the Swami was right. So we heard a little bit about impersonal meditation, because that's what we had learned by reading Bhagavad Gita and Buddhist books about we should give up all desires, we should become desireless and merge into the nothingness called nirvana, or in Sanskrit it would be called Brahmajyoti. And when you merge and you don't have any desires and you're merged into nothingness, it becomes very boring. So Prabhupada was introducing the spiritual world, which was full of all types of sensual enjoyments on the transcendental platform, not on the mundane platform. So as Dan heard more and more, he was realizing, because he knew about the nothingness of nirvana, and one gets very bored there. So Prabhupada was giving him a higher taste for him to experience in his lectures. Now, afterwards, because Prabhupada would encourage the devotees, they would write articles called How I Came to Krishna Consciousness. And in the Back to Godhead magazines that Prabhupada would soon be starting again, they would put these articles. So Dan, he wrote an article about how he came to Krishna consciousness. I've taken some of the extracts because, of course, Satsvarup Maharaj, he is objectively presenting what's happening. But then when you hear directly what the devotees are experiencing themselves, we can identify more with their own realizations. So this is what Dan had to say. What had happened was, Dan was waiting for a friend because he was a film artist, making films and going to different rehearsals and things like that. It just so happened that he had to meet one of his friends to catch a bus right in front of 26 2nd Avenue. And while he was standing there on the street, he looked inside the window and he saw Prabhupada giving a lecture to some young people. But he dared not go in because he didn't know what Prabhupada was teaching. So as he was outside looking in the window, this is what he was thinking. I was scared. Scared because I was attracted. And I knew what that attraction meant. I would have to stop having sex. I would have to give up all kinds of things. These impressions came to me in the 3 or 4 seconds allowed me by the fast-moving bus. During the late summer, the Krishna conscious people were the subject of many conversations on the Lower East Side. Most of the neighborhood beats means the beatniks or the hippies, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but the beats who lived there on the Lower East Side, the musicians, the artists, and the people taking intoxication, looking for some counterculture, alternative lifestyle, kept their distance. So most of them kept their distance because they couldn't follow the principles, the four regulative principles. And when you go to the kirtans, naturally, someone's going to talk to you, you have questions, and they'll introduce the four regulative principles. And the hippies or the beatniks, they weren't willing to follow those principles. I too hesitated to walk through the storefront door into that other world. After a kirtan of 20 minutes or so, the Swami spoke. So Dan had come in, and he had been given wooden sticks, and he sat down for the kirtan. He was attracted to the kirtan. But then when Swamiji started speaking, he just waited because he wanted the next kirtan to start. I had expected a smiling, light-hearted, wizardly fellow. Instead, the Swami was dead serious. His lecture concentrated on the evils of sex, which he railed against with vigor. Prabhupada was not compromising. He wanted these people to give up their sinful activities so they could take to real spiritual life. During the question and answer period, he employed a quickness of wit and startling perceptiveness in his responses. It was plain he dwelled in a world of mystics and saints who were completely real to him. No matter how much grief it caused me, I was determined to proceed further along this path. I became a regular at the storefront. So even in this picture, we don't have too many pictures of Prabhupada at this time at 26 2nd Avenue, because after Dan joined, he became the photographer. But you'll see here, here's Dan. He's listening. So Dan, he did the movies for the devotees once he became dedicated. Now we're back to Judy. Judy began attending both the morning and evening classes. She had to rise by 5 o'clock to get to the storefront on time, and her mother and father protested. But Judy didn't care. She would ride an hour and a half on the subway before dawn downtown to the Swami's meetings, where she would be the only girl present. So the New York subways are actually very dangerous, especially in the dark, because you're underground and it's like trains running underground. And if anything happens in those trains, there's nobody there to help you. There are a lot of muggings and thefts and all kinds of unspeakable things. But Judy was so determined that she would leave her parents' home, travel an hour and a half on the subway while it was still dark, just to get to the classes in time at 6 o'clock, 6:30. When the Swami heard that Judy was an art student, he asked her to paint for Krishna. She set up a canvas in the front room of the apartment, and under his guidance, she began painting. For her first assignment, he asked her to paint a portrait of his Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He gave her a photo and instructed her. There should be a flower garland around Guru Maharaj's neck. The tilak should be yellowish, not white. And there should be no effulgence or halo around his head. So now, before we had Harvey Cohen, he was an artist who made an enlargement of the small Panchatattva picture that Prabhupada had brought with him. And that picture what was in the storefront there, See, that was the picture that was there that Harvey Cohen made. Harvey eventually also became initiated as Hari Das. And now a second artist has come, Judy, and Prabhupada immediately put her to work. He had her paint. Now, of course, here in Vrindavan, we know that we can tell a person's beliefs just by their forehead here. If they have the thick tilak, if they have the horizontal tilak, if they have the red dot, all of these things, we get to read a person just by their forehead here. Prabhupada explained once that for women, you don't have to talk to a woman to know her social status. You just see how she's dressed. You see how she wears her hair. If her hair is parted in the middle, it means she's chaste. If her hair is parted on the side, Prabhupada says it means she's a prostitute. And if they're wearing a dot, it means she's married, a bindi. So in India, the men don't have to speak to the women. Just by looking at them, they could understand their social status. So we see here also they're selling white tilak, yellow tilak, black tilak, according to the different attitudes that they have in their worship. So because we wear gopi chandan, which is yellowish in color, Prabhupada explained to her, first off, he should have yellowish tilak. At one time, we were worshipping Radha Parthasarathi in Delhi. And sometimes here in India, they put a red tilak on Krishna. So Prabhupada came in for darshan, and I was the pujari. So he came in and he looked because the deities had come painted with red tilak. We just kept the tilak there. So when he came in, he told me that Krishna should not wear red tilak. Krishna should wear the chandan colored tilak. So then we took off that red tilak. So we didn't know things until Prabhupada taught them to us. Then when he told one of us, that knowledge would be spread all over the society, and we would change the standard according to what Prabhupada gave in one place. So now, when we paint the pictures of the parampara, they're not supposed to have halos. The halos, the Brahma-teja, that's for the Supreme Lord. They should always have a flower garland, and they should have yellow-colored tilak. And all of these instructions, Prabhupada, from here on, Prabhupada would give Jadharani, or Judy, so many instructions for painting. And eventually, for instance, this picture, we didn't have a picture of Judy painting at the apartment. After some time, after Judy became initiated, and then Prabhupada wanted to expand the temples, she married Satsvarup, who wrote this book, and sent them to Boston to open a temple and to start the first printing press, the ISKCON press. So Judy, along with other artists, they were in the art department, and this picture is when she lived there in Boston. Bob. I began chanting and studying the Srimad Bhagavatam at home and attending the kirtan and classes at the storefront. After the last kirtan in the evening, the Swami would take a bowl made out of simulated wood and a little paring knife, just a small knife like this, and a couple of apples that had been sitting on the edge of his lectern. And he would cut the apples up in the little bowl and hand the bowl to a disciple. The disciple would then offer him the first piece, and he would pop it into his mouth. Now, as Prabhupada's cook and servant, we could always see Prabhupada would never touch his hand to his mouth. He would throw the prasadam into his mouth, even rice and dal. He would put it in his hand, just enough that it would go into his mouth, throw it into his mouth. So even this little piece of apple, he would throw into his mouth. The rest of the pieces of apple would be distributed to the crowd. I remember one time when he was chewing on his piece of apple, and he spit the seeds out on the floor up against the wall. They bounced off the wall onto the floor next to the dais. And I was thinking, how wonderful. Nobody would do anything like that in America. But here, no one else can do that. No one else would have the nerve to do such a thing. Prabhupada was so expert that sometimes he would spit right into the sink. Perfect target. So some of Prabhupada's practices would impress his students in different ways. Now, Dan, we're back to Dan, because Dan, being the film artist, with his aesthetic filmmaker's eye, Dan appreciated Swamiji's manner. Dan, there was a sink right next to the dais where he sat. It was so close that he could have leaned over and touched it. After cutting up an apple, he would take the scraps and just fling them into the sink. It was very casual. I was very impressed by that, because his movements were very aristocratic, and he had, like putting on tilak. Someone had given Prabhupada a little compact with a mirror, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he didn't use a mirror. And the devotee asked Prabhupada, Prabhupada, do you use a mirror? He said, yes, I use a mirror, but I can also put it on without a mirror. So Prabhupada, he was so expert in everything that he did, and the devotees would just watch him, his hand movements, the way he spoke, the way he held his head. They had never seen anyone so aristocratic with such behavior before, and they would start imitating him. When Prabhupada entered Samadhi and they made the first 11 gurus, and they thought that they were going to have to carry on what Prabhupada did, so they would start talking like Prabhupada, holding their head like Prabhupada, because they thought they had to be like Prabhupada. It didn't last long, but it was so funny for us to watch them, though. They were trying their best. And one time, Brahmananda came up and wanted 50 cents for something. And the Swami reached down and picked up his little black purse, the kind that closes by a metal clasp at the top. He snapped it open, looked inside very perspicaciously, and I'm sure nobody knows what that means. I looked it up. It means wisely. And then his hand came up like a bird and like an eagle hovering in flight above its prey. But the hand didn't pounce. It just delicately drifted down, took out a 50-cent piece, and rose up again as if it were being lifted up on a balloon. And everyone was watching Prabhupada, of course. It was graceful. It was a dance, a ballet. He just picked up this 50-cent piece and lifted it into Brahmananda's hand. I couldn't believe it. Someone asks you for a 50-cent piece, you just dig in your pockets and throw it at them. But the Swami seemed to treat everything as Krishna's property. And this 50-cent piece was treated with such care. Now, of course, for the Americans, 50 cents is nothing. But in those days, you could live on 1 rupee a day. When we first lived here, we would have 1 rupee a day to live on. And a rupee would buy a lot. So in those days, 6 rupees equaled $1. Now it's 87 rupees equals $1. So 6 rupees equaling $1, it meant 50 cents was worth 3 rupees, which was enough for a man to live on for 3 days. So Prabhupada saw things differently than the way the Americans did. For him, 50 cents was a lot. It was enough that a person could live on for 3 days. So that's why he, very carefully, everything was Krishna's. And what Prabhupada would have to do to get that 50 cents? Sell his books, give lectures, pass the basket around along with the apple, see if anybody would put anything in the basket. Sometimes he would only come out with $4 for a whole night of kirtan and lecture. Sometimes someone would put in $100. Prabhupada never knew what he was getting. So that 50 cents meant a lot to Srila Prabhupada, and the devotees were seeing that. Here's Bob Rupanuga again. But it's not from this time. These pictures that we have here now, the next few pictures of Rupanuga and Prabhupada, they're from when Prabhupada and he were together, sometimes in Mayapur, sometimes in Los Angeles, and we have an archive of 19,500 pictures of Srila Prabhupada. So I went through them. Any picture I could find of Rupanuga, you'll see here. And Rupanuga was not just was, he's still alive, such a humble devotee. Some devotees would always be there right next to Prabhupada. Rupanuga would just be in the back, listening very attentively to Srila Prabhupada, very humble. Although he was made one of the first GBCs by Prabhupada. Did we read that? Yeah. The weeks went by. Some of the devotees had spoken to Bob about initiation, but he was unsure. He didn't know exactly what initiation was, but it seemed to him that the other devotees were eager to get him initiated because he was working and had a family. To Bob's way of thinking, he represented maturity to them, a middle-class American, and they were eager to land him. So aside from Mukunda and Janaki, none of the disciples were married. Especially, they didn't have children. So Bob, his name was Robert. That's where the name Rupanuga came from. A lot of times the names would be similar, start with the same initial. So Bob, he was already quite well established. Wife, child, good job. So they were inviting him to take initiation, but he had to be convinced first. This is in Mayapur. Now, eventually, Rupanuga did take sannyas, but that's many years later. Bob's wife wasn't interested, and his friends were downright opposed. He couldn't spend much time with Prabhupada or the devotees, since he was either at the office or at home with his family. Bob. So they were asking me if I was interested in initiation. I said I would think about it. I hadn't stopped smoking. I hadn't made the final decision. The first real personal exchange I had with the Swami was when I asked for initiation. The rest of the time I was so much in awe of him that it didn't occur to me to say anything. I always wanted to. I felt puffed up, and I always thought, well, I should be able to talk to him. Maybe I should do something. So this expression, puffed up, this is something that we also learned from Prabhupada. Prabhupada would speak in Victorian English, and puffed up means proud, So these little expressions, they were carryover from when Prabhupada would speak. The example Prabhupada gave of the frog in the well, we've all heard that story. He would puff himself up. Is the ocean this big, this big, this big, and then he exploded. But I was always kind of reluctant to do it. I didn't think it was my place. I guess maybe I was afraid. but I was getting up early and chanting 32 rounds a day, many of them on the subway. Because in New York, you'd have to travel by subway, just like nowadays they have the metro in Delhi, but that's overhead. The subways are 2 floors down, 3 floors down, just like going into hell, really. And people would live on the subways. They wouldn't have anywhere else to live. I was afraid of the material world because I didn't have much association with devotees, and I wanted to insulate myself by chanting more. So he's a new bhakta, chanting 32 rounds because he was afraid of the material world. He had really gotten the message right. This is Rupanuga when he became a grihasta. This is his little son, who Prabhupada named Ekendra. He went to the Gurukula. Judy was another person who was considering initiation, and I asked her what she was going to do about it. And she said, "I'm thinking about it." And then she told me she had decided she would get initiated and give up all her bad habits. I began to think maybe I could give up these things too, so I asked what to do. How do I approach him? And Kirtanananda said, "Well, you go up to his room." I was surprised it was so easy. So, of course, as Americans they grew up with meat eating, illicit sex, intoxication. That's the lifestyle at that time in America. They might take the determination to give up the sinful activities, but it's not that they were able to necessarily follow through for the rest of their life. And Prabhupada had to deal with that as well. So Judy here is saying she decided to give up all of her sinful activities, but it wasn't that she was necessarily able to follow even after initiation, unfortunately. I had prepared a little speech in my mind. "My dear Swamiji, would you kindly accept me as your disciple and teach me about Krishna consciousness?" I went up to his room without an appointment and knocked on the door. I heard him say, "Come in." I entered the room, and he was sitting behind his desk. He was alone. I made obeisances, and he looked at me and said, "Yes?" And I said, "Swamiji, will you make me your disciple?" And that's as far as I got. I was going to say, "And teach me the philosophy of Krishna consciousness," but he didn't let me finish my speech. He said, "Yes." It was so simple. I thought, well, there's nothing else to say. He has accepted me. So I thanked him and paid my obeisances and left. "You know, you're not supposed to be up here unless you're initiated," Achyutananda said. Judy was flustered. She had come upstairs to put some dirty pots in the kitchen. "Oh, yes," she replied. "That's just what I wanted to talk to Swamiji about." And she went into Prabhupada's room, where he was talking with a few other people. "Swamiji, could I please get initiated?" she asked. And he said, "Do you know the 4 rules?" "Yes." "Can you follow them?" "Yes." "Then you can be initiated in 2 weeks. This picture is Judy, or by that time she was Jadharani, when she was at the Boston Temple, because her husband was the president. She had to set a very good example for all the devotees there. And she's at the Commonwealth, the park, distributing books, magazines. We only had the magazines at that time. Now, just see this beautiful picture. This is Rupanuga, his wife, Kalindi. Such a beautiful devotee. She was the perfection of motherhood for all the devotees. We just took her as a mother. She was so loving to everyone. There's their son, Akendra. And they would go out just alone. This is what we did as Grihastas. They would go to a city and just start chanting and dancing on the street to attract people. So there they are, husband, wife, and son, chanting Hare Krishna on the streets. This is in Fort Lauderdale. It's after they got initiated and they went for preaching. Dan was also thinking about initiation, but he wanted to wait. He was chanting 16 rounds and attending all the classes, despite his reluctant wife. He had always had difficulty with authority figures, but he could feel that the Swami was winning him over and wearing down his impersonal barrier. 2 weeks later, Prabhupada held another initiation ceremony. Bob became Rupanuga, and Judy became Jadharani. Dan needed a little more time. So I really would like to share the glories of Rupanuga and Kalindi, because did you ever go to the Buffalo Temple when they were there? Well, I was sent there in 1970, and because my parents were going to kidnap me, so they sent me to Buffalo. Because no one knew where Buffalo was. I lived in Pennsylvania. No one had ever heard of Buffalo. So they sent me there to stay with Rupanuga and his wife Kalindi. And they were so affectionate. That temple was just like a family. Because Rupanuga, he used to give classes at the University of Buffalo, New York University there. And he gave these Bhagavad Gita classes that attracted so many devotees. Some of our key, to this day, leaders came out of those Bhagavad Gita classes. And he wouldn't stop there. When the devotees would come to the temple, because he was educated and very learned, after the classes, like our Srimad Bhagavatam classes, he would give us assignments. We would have to write essays about the philosophy. And this would make us really sharp in the philosophy. This is long before, we had anything like Bhakti Shastri. None of us took Bhakti. We didn't know what Bhakti Shastri was. But he was preparing us to become preachers that way. And his wife was the best cook in the whole world. She would cook for all of us. They had beautiful little Jagannath deities. And it's freezing cold in Buffalo. It's so cold, like Canada. We would go out on Sankirtan with our boots and our gloves and our hats and our coats and stand out there and dance on the streets. And we'd have to, like the person who was chanting, who was playing the mridanga, they'd have to wear gloves and tie their fingers with tape so that their fingers wouldn't split from the cold, You remember that? And we'd all be chanting there ecstatically in the freezing cold with the snow all around us. But it was such a happy time at that temple. And so many devotees came from there. And from there, they would be sent out to make other temples. Like Bhagavan and his wife, they were sent to Detroit. Ayodhyapati, who's Bibi Govinda Maharaj, he went to Toronto. And everywhere they would send them out. Rupanuga and Kalindi, the mother and father, would send their children out to open up temples all over America and Canada. Right? Jagadish, I think he joined there. Right. Jagadish, Lakshmi Moni, they all came from Rupanuga's family there. Yeah, Prahlad Nana Swami, Burijan, Tejas and Madeira, right? Prabhupada had them come to India, and he started the Delhi temple. So many devotees, just by their devotion. You can see how transcendental they are, like saints coming from Vaikuntha. So now we're on chapter 21, finally. Beyond the Lower East Side. So this is the little blurb at the front. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. I never thought that Krishna consciousness would go beyond the Lower East Side. What to speak of New York City? I thought that this was it, and would stay here eternally. This is Brahmananda. This is in January of, because Prabhupada, he had asked Mukunda and Janaki to open a temple in California, San Francisco. They went there, they had success, they were making so many devotees, they invited Prabhupada, and Prabhupada for the first time was going to leave New York City. And the devotees in 26 Second Avenue, they never thought that Prabhupada would leave them. They thought this was it. This was the spiritual tirtha that Prabhupada was making, and but there was Prabhupada now. He was going to fly for the first time to San Francisco. Hare Krishna was becoming popular. Regular kirtans in the park, newspaper coverage. Hayagriva called it the Hare Krishna explosion. And later Hayagriva wrote a whole book called the Hare Krishna explosion. We'll take some excerpts from that as we go along. The Lower East Side hippies considered the chanting of Hare Krishna, quote, one of the grooviest things happening. And that the Swami's disciples didn't take LSD didn't seem to affect their popularity. The devotees were accepted as angelic people, carrying the peaceful chanting to others and offering free food and a free place to stay. You could get the most interesting vegetarian food free at their place if you went at the right time. And in their storefront, on the shelf by the door, were books from India. In the clubs, local musicians played the melody that they had picked up from the Swami when he chanted in the park and at the temple. The Lower East Side was a neighborhood of artists and musicians, and now it was also the neighborhood of Hare Krishna. Because this chanting, you see, Prabhupada not only sent the devotees, went with the devotees to Tompkins Square Park, Washington Park, he would send them out on Sankirtan, he would call them parades, in the streets. So all the young people heard this chanting of Hare Krishna. They had heard it before from Allen Ginsberg, but Allen Ginsberg only knew one tune. He thought that was the Hare Krishna mantra, but Prabhupada had so many beautiful tunes. So the musicians, they were picking up on those nice tunes and incorporating it into their music. Burton Green. Musicians were influenced by it. The Krishna chant, Govinda Jaya Jaya, and other chants. Prabhupada was teaching them different mantras. I used some of those chants when I recorded. A lot of musicians reached out for this in different ways. We would explode in a short time and blow off. That means the music would get really explosive. But then keep the chant underneath as a basis. A lot of people found that spiritual vibration even in the midst of the heavy music they were doing. They were becoming devotee musicians. Now, this is from the internet about who is Burton Green. He was known in New York City in the Lower East Side, but none of us knew who he was. Chicago-born Narada Burton Green, that was his spiritual name, was an American free jazz pianist who rose to popularity for his work in New York City. He explored multiple genres of music, including avant-garde or experimental jazz. Green played during the 1960s on New York's free jazz scene, gigging with musicians. Gigging, we've heard that word before. It's when musicians get together and it's like a practice for when they go onto the stage and practice and perform. His autobiography, written over 20 years, is called Memoirs of a Musical Pesty Mystic. He was a mystic, but maybe couldn't give up all the 4 regulative principles that had to be followed. Narada is a spiritual name given to him by his yoga teacher of many years, Swami Satchidananda. So this picture is one of his record albums. We didn't have CDs in those days. We had big black record albums. You can see them in Prabhupada's house with the machine that would play them. And he would go by the name Narada. Evening kirtans were always big. Brahmananda used to stand by the back door every night and watch the room fill up until there was no space, no place left to sit. There was a lot of interest in the group chanting and music making. But after the kirtan, when the talk was to begin, people would start to leave. It was not uncommon for half the audience to leave before the talk began. And sometimes people would leave in the middle of the lecture. But Dan stayed, Bob stayed, Judy stayed, and eventually all three of them became initiated disciples. Dan became Damodar, Bob became Rupanuga, and Judy became Jadurani. Okay? Hare Krishna.